Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about some lesser known buried treasures in the Midwest, and we are going to talk about a state that had a lot of different trails coming through it. So you had a lot of people coming through in the 1800s, and a lot of buried treasure stories are in this area. And the state we're talking about is Nebraska. So there are a lot of stories of lost or buried treasures, throughout the Midwest, but some areas are more of a mecca for them than others. And some of these stories have been off of the radar or very seldomly talked about. And Nebraska holds a special place in the annals of history when it comes to this. And the reason is that there's a lot of different trails. Like Ogallala, Nebraska was the terminus for many of the cattle drives north, and I believe that was on the Great Western Cattle Drive Trail. So they ended up in Ogallala. The cowboys got paid once they sold their cattle. I believe the cattle were being loaded onto the Union Pacific rail cars there and sent off to Chicago for market. So the cowboys got paid. They went into the bars and they drank a little too much, and a lot of things happened. People got robbed too, and the town of Ogallala was said to be one of the toughest towns in the West. So not only did you have a lot of money and activity going on around Ogallala in the late 1800s, you also had in the mid 1800s, you had the Oregon and Mormon trails that came through Nebraska. And one trail was on the south side of the Platte River, which I believe was the Oregon Trail, and the Mormon Trail typically ran on the north side of the river. So you had a lot of these pioneers that were coming through, and talking thousands of travelers that came through on these trails, and some had buried their money near their wagons at night when danger seemed to be lurking near. And there were a lot of reasons that danger may be near, whether it was Native Americans that were near or stories of bandits being near. So at night, a lot of the wagon train participants that were heading west were burying their treasure and going to dig it up the next morning and continue on their travels. That way, if they got robbed, the bandits wouldn't know where their money was and they could retrieve it the next day. Well, as you know, some of those travelers got attacked by Native Americans or bandits or whatever the situation happened to be, or they had other hardships causing them to lose their money. And so there's said to be a lot of buried treasures and caches like this along the trails also. The Nebraska Sandhills were also home to cattle rustlers and other notorious bandits. And this is more in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. These bandits also robbed stagecoaches that operated on the stagecoach lines that went through Nebraska. Also, the Pony Express ran through Nebraska. And all of these things contributed to why Nebraska has an abundance of buried treasure stories, and many of which never got a whole lot of press and probably were not looked for in the same degree as many other popular treasures and popular treasure stories people have heard through the ages. Now, some of these stories don't have a ton of details because they didn't get a lot of press, but nonetheless, they still may be out there, or possibly maybe even more likely to still be out there. And we're going to go over a few of those stories for you. So, This story has a few details that I don't believe are correct. And we'll go over what the story says, and we'll go over some reasons I don't think that it's correct. And then we'll point out where the correct area may actually be. So, this story talks about a buried treasure near Broadwater, Nebraska. So all of the details of this story that I've seen, they almost copy each other or seem to all say the same thing, and people don't realize that there's a major issue with this. So this is what all the popular treasure stories on this treasure say, or pretty much what all the different accounts I've seen have said. So it says, located about a mile north of Broadwater, Nebraska, is Mud Springs. A wealthy gambler is said to have buried $20,000 in gold coins near Mud Springs. Broadwater, Nebraska is still in the Broadwater, Nebraska is in the panhandle of Nebraska. It is on the banks of the North Platte River and right off of Highway 26. So that is a lot of the details that about the location, but that location is wrong. So the problem with this is that Mud Springs, in the stories, it says it's just north of Broadwater, Nebraska, a mile or so. That's totally, completely wrong. So Mud Springs was named for the seeps of water on the dry plateau between the North Platte River and Lodgepole Creek. So the North Platte River runs in a northeasterly direction or northwesterly direction up through the Nebraska Panhandle and off into Wyoming. And Lodgepole Creek runs due east-west, and Lodgepole Creek does eventually dump into the North Platte River, but it creates this big triangular plateau area that is very dry and very desolate, and when these trails came through there, obviously if there's water anywhere on this dry plateau, that's going to be a oasis and going to be an area that travelers are going to want to stop to, let their horses have a drink, to get a drink themselves, refill some water, canteens and things like that. So Mud Springs was on a trail system which started about in the 1850s or so, especially when a cutoff was made from Old Julesburg, Colorado, to the North Platte River Trail, which was running in a northwesterly direction. And it passed by very near Courthouse and Jailhouse Rocks, which are still very popular sites in western Nebraska. The Pony Express even built a station at Mud Springs, and it also became a stagecoach stop on the Overland Trail stagecoach route. And in February of 1865, Sioux and Cheyenne warriors attacked at Mud Springs in retaliation for a recent attack on Cheyennes near Sand Creek, Colorado. And in 1939, the Mud Springs Station site went on the National Register of Historic Places, and I believe the landowners at that time donated that land location or area to the state for preservation. So I'm not sure with this area. It might be owned by the state now. I don't know the exact situation with the ownership of the land. But Mud Springs is really located about 15 miles south of Bridgeport, and Bridgeport is just a few miles from Broadwater. So Mud Springs is about 15 miles south of Bridgeport, or about 6 miles north of Dalton, Nebraska, off of Highway 80 or Highway 385, the Gold Rush Highway. So there is a historical marker right off of the highway, not far from the location. So there's a lot of stuff that is in the right general vicinity as far as the historical marker and stuff like that. But there seems to be, when it comes to this story, there seem to be people that just look at other people's stories and repeat those stories without determining that the location that's been quoted is not correct, not even remotely close. So people using those stories won't get anywhere near where Mud Springs really is. And even today, if you use Google Maps and you look up Mud Springs, you will see the Pony Express station site and Mud Springs Ranch. And when you kind of zoom out and you look at Mud Springs, you'll see that it's still very green right around there, where there is still a good water seep coming out of the ground there, which is providing water for all the trees and all the greenery right around there. And then when you get a little ways away from that area, it goes to high desert type of plains, and there's literally pretty much no water. So you can tell why it used to be a stop on these stagecoach and trail, lines. So anyhow, that's the situation with Mud Springs. So the next area we're going to talk about is Devil's Nest, Nebraska, which got its nickname because it is a rough canyon area filled with forested areas that just go up and down the canyons, and it was named because it is a devil's nest of an area. It's difficult to navigate through, and it is located in northeast Nebraska, and it was a well-known hideout for outlaws. A lot of outlaws, supposedly. So since it was rough, desolate country, the lawmen didn't venture into there. There's no towns or anything like that, and you could get lost in this area very easily. And so the lawmen usually didn't go into this area because they could be walking into an ambush. And it was said that outlaws hid out in many of the caves. They may have buried a lot of their treasure here to come back for later, and we all know what happens to outlaws. A lot of times they'll bury their treasures various places to come back for them, but they get in a gunfight or something here or there, and they get killed, and the treasures are left behind. And Devil's Nest is supposed to have a lot of outlaw loot because it was a prime haven for outlaws to hide out. And it's still very desolate today. That area has very little population. It's just south of the Missouri River. It's next to the Santee Sioux Native American Reservation, and it's in Knox County, Nebraska. So this area, it's still very rough, very desolate, and very pretty in its own ways, and probably pretty good hunting area too. So the next area we are going to talk about is in the Nebraska Sandhills country, and there are a couple of stories to go over in the Nebraska Sandhills, which is kind of in the central part or north central part of Nebraska. And the first treasure we're going to talk about is located near Mullen, Nebraska. And that is located on Nebraska Highway 2 in the heart of Sandhill Country. And there's said to be a story of cattle thieves who buried approximately $25,000 in gold coins near Mullen, Nebraska. And this really isn't hard to believe because the Sandhills area of Nebraska is prime cattle ranching country, and a lot of outlaws and cattle rustlers and cattle thieves did operate in this sparsely populated area where cattle greatly outnumber people. So there's not a ton of details on that one as to the exact location, just that it is near Mullen, Nebraska. Also in the Sandhills area of Nebraska is a small town of Seneca, Nebraska. And this is just a few miles east of Mullen. And, we just talked about Mullen. So it was said that a miner from the California goldfields on his way back home to the east was attacked by outlaws near Seneca, Nebraska. He had $70,000 in gold coins and bullion on him. And he was injured pretty bad in the confrontation, but he was able to make his escape. And it was said he buried his gold somewhere about 2 miles east of Seneca along the banks of the Middle Loop River. And he died shortly afterwards and had not revealed his location to anyone. So I don't know if he escaped the bandits and if he got injured and buried his treasure, and if someone found him on his deathbed and couldn't determine where he buried his treasure, or if he told someone that he buried treasure down by the river and no one was able to find it and then he died. But anyhow, a couple of miles east of Seneca, Nebraska, on the banks of the Middle Loop River, is his treasure. If it was $70,000 worth of treasure back then, it's probably millions today. So for those interested in the Nebraska Sandhills, it is a beautiful area that is still sparsely populated. And the Sandhills are gently rolling, grass-covered sand dunes, and many spring-fed rivers and lakes exist in this area due to the Ogallala Aquifer under much of the land. So today, Mullen, that we talked about a moment ago, is a mecca for a new sport called tanking. And it is an awesome and fun sport or leisurely pastime activity where you float down the gentle flowing spring-fed Middle Loop River in a livestock tank. Yeah, that's right, a livestock tank. So it was started, I believe, as kind of I guess just a coincidence that this really caught on, because I believe what happened in the early days of this was that a rancher had hopped in a livestock tank to float it down to one of his fields instead of try to get it there another way, and he was able to do that and then get it up onto his ranch land down the river a ways. Well, it ended up catching on, and people determined, hey, this is pretty fun. And so now you can do this. And like I said, Mullen is a mecca for this, where they rent the tanks, and obviously it's a big tank. You don't have to haul it or anything like that. So there is a outfitter there that you can go to, and they will take you upriver, get you going in a tank, and then you float downriver to the place that you park your car, and you leave the tank on the beach, and you can take off from there. And it is a blast. So that is nice to do because a lot of people canoe the rivers, but a canoe is not near as stable as a livestock tank. And you can fit more people in a livestock tank, and a cooler full of sandwiches and beer or whatever, and it's relaxing to float on the river. And it's not like a canoe where if your canoe starts to get sideways, you got to hurry up and straighten it out before you hit anything upcoming. It doesn't matter if a tank spins around or rotates a bit as you're going down the river. So I've done it many times with the family, and it is a blast. Even the young kids have a fun time doing it. Also, the Niobrara River is on the north edge of the Sandhills and has beautiful bluffs and waterfalls falling into the river as you canoe or tube by on the Niobrara National Scenic Waterway. And it's worth a 26-mile canoe trip to do that section of the Niobrara River, which starts just east of Valentine, Nebraska. But it is a beautiful river, and there are some bluffs on the south side of the river that have some waterfalls falling into the river. And there is also a great spot to beach your canoe at Smith Falls, Nebraska's tallest waterfall, and it is a state park there too. So you beach your canoe and you can walk down just a little trail and you see a 70 or 80 foot tall waterfall cascading over a rock precipice. It's really cool, and you can get pretty much right underneath it. So if you go treasure hunting in these areas, or you just want to explore the sandhills, these excursions are worth their weight in gold. So back out to western Nebraska for one final treasure story, and this treasure story is located near Sidney, Nebraska. And Sidney is located about 25 miles, maybe 30 miles south of Mud Springs that we talked about earlier in this video. So if you have already heard of Sidney, Nebraska, it is most likely that you probably heard of it because it is the world headquarters of Cabela's Outdoor Outfitters, and the very first Cabela store was here, and I believe it is still there, and it has some awesome displays. So Sidney is located on Highway 30, the old Lincoln Highway that was also a popular stagecoach route. And in 1867, Outlaws robbed the Treasure Express stagecoach of 400 pounds of gold nuggets. And the posse was hot on their tail shortly after the robbery, and the Outlaws knew that they needed to bury the loot to reduce their load and try to make a getaway. And they buried the loot on the south bank of Lodgepole Creek, about 2 miles east of Sidney. And very shortly after they did so, the posse caught up to them, and they were hanged shortly afterwards, never revealing exactly where they buried the treasure. But some empty bags and empty chests were found near an area about 2 miles east of Sidney on the south bank of Lodgepole Creek. So that is why it was believed that the treasure was buried somewhere nearby there. So those are just a few stories of lost and buried treasure in Nebraska, and some of the great things to do if you were in the mood for taking in the countryside or a little extra adventure. So now if you go looking for any of these treasures, of course you're going to want to make sure that you're not on private property or you get permission from landowners. And sandhills and western Nebraska are known territory for prairie rattler snakes, so you want to watch out for the rattlesnakes also. And I know around Chimney Rock, Courthouse Rock, Jailhouse Rocks, and some of those areas are notorious for prairie rattlesnakes, but they're not quite as fierce as the western diamondbacks. But obviously be careful if you're out there, and if you decide to take an excursion on going tanking or canoeing on the Niobrara River, definitely do so. It is an excursion that you will not forget. It is a lot of fun. And you can let me know if you have any comments, and like and subscribe.